Well, good afternoon, and it's good to be here. It's good to be here on the 100th anniversary of both of our states' independence. Of course, I will neglect from pointing out that Lithuania merely celebrates the 100th anniversary of a restoration of independence, but that's by the by. Still, the title, as it is conceived in this conference, is not of my choice. I mean, it was suggested to me, and I sort of accepted. And I realized the difficulty of the task of the organizers of such conferences. They're like people who invite a few people to dinner and say, well, bring some ingredient of your choice. And then sort of, at the end of the day, they hope that these ingredients will somehow cohere into into coherent meal. So I hope that sort of, my paper, my talk is going somehow add another dimension to what's been discussed throughout the day. Right, sovereignty. Sovereignty, as it is commonly and traditionally understood, is a metaphysical concept. And I realize the dangers of saying that in a sort of probably least metaphysical nation of Europe, Estonia. What is meant by metaphysical concept? Well, it's a bit like the concept of nation, which we invoke in our constitutions. Who has seen the Estonian nation? Well, nobody. I mean, we say that it expresses itself during the election, but actually only sort of about, 70-60% of it turn up to vote. So in its totality, as an entity, it's never seen. We postulate its existence. We derive very important consequences from it, but it is a metaphysical notion. It's similar with sovereignty. Sovereignty, as it is functions in our legal system, is indivisible. I liked to point out when I was first elected in the parliament that you have before you 141st part of the Lithuanian sovereignty, because there are 141 members of parliament. But that doesn't work that way. I mean, the parliament as a whole represents the sovereignty of the Lithuanian nation, not each member of the parliament, because otherwise you would have a very conflicting sovereignties running around and sometimes even hitting each other. So it doesn't work like that. Sovereignty is indivisible. It's whole. It's undiminishing. It's the same whether I yesterday said that, Lithuania lost about a fourth of its population in the last 3 decades. Nevertheless, it's equally sovereign now as it was then. It's indestructible. You can, as the Soviets did, you can occupy the country, but its sovereignty lives on in some in the embassies in Washington and then Rome and then London. It's immaterial. Of course, sovereignty has many attributes, such as territory, constitution, army, government, political structure. It is populated by this metaphysical construct, which is the Lithuanian nation, but itself is separate from those attributes, and it's not confined to them. Sovereignty, in traditional sense, and the sense that we still use, is a bit like, Carl Schmitt's famous theory of secularization. He says that, all constructive or fruitful political notions are secularized theological notions. And then he uses the example of sovereignty as one example. The theological idea of omnipotent God is represented in political sphere by the principle of sovereignty. And absolutist sovereignty is replaced by deist Republican sovereignty, but nevertheless, as long as there is a person who can, an instance which can decree on the Ausnahmezustand, on the case of exception, on the suspension of the laws, which is the equivalent of miracle in theology, there is sovereignty, and that's the kind of the critical instance of proving the sovereignty. Anyway, so that's the traditional notion of sovereignty, a metaphysical notion. And that notion of sovereignty is very useful, and now that's the end of metaphysical discourse so far. It's very useful when nations decide to treat their interests as falling under the heading of exercise of sovereignty. Consider, for example, Nord Stream 2. Nord Stream 2, as it is presented by Germany and Russia, is a deal between two sovereign nations for their common good, for the common good of their citizens. and nobody can say anything to the contrary, as long as the sovereignties of other nations are not violated, for example, by cutting through their territorial waters. Then they have some sort of say, but beyond that, basically you cannot contradict it, because that's sovereignty. We exercise our sovereignty, that's basically not your business. But is that so? Is that really so? Well, let's consider implications of Nord Stream 2. What does it do? Well, first and foremost, it increases Europe's, including Germany's, energy dependence on Russian gas. Right, well, that's nothing new. But what that means, it potentially diminishes its capacity in the future to accept free decisions. Free decisions vis-à-vis Russia, it potentially actually damages its sovereignty. Switching off the gas at a critical moment can severely damage several sovereign nations' possibility to wage war, for example, or to basically function as states. So it's directly already involves the future potential diminution of sovereignty of one of the states involved. And notice that I already introduced a kind of notion of European sovereignty, but we'll get back to that. Also, it already, not in the future, but already, as soon as it starts functioning, makes Europe less free to pursue its values. You don't want to implement your values if it clashes with the profit interests of Nord Stream. It's a way through, and then the way which has been used extensively by our esteemed, and I say it ironically, Eastern neighbor, through investments, strategic purchases, trade deals, opening or closing of markets, exclusive deals on gas and oil, that Russia ties European states to itself, precluding exercise of its full sovereignty vis-à-vis Russia. Full sovereignty, I mean by freedom to accept the choice dictated by their constitutive values and by the will of their populations. For example, I wonder when Germany or Austria will implement Magnitsky Act. Do you have any clue? I don't. Not in the near future. Even though, if you ask an ordinary German politician, they will totally, and I believe sincerely, agree with the principles of rule of law, transparency, protections of honest citizens against criminal gangs, and so on and so forth. But when you ask them as politicians when they will implement an act expressing that kind of value commitment through their democratic elected parliaments, you will get a very mumbling and a very indistinct response, which means never. Niemand. So when it comes to Russia, somehow they are even though they in everyday life express this commitment to these principles, they are incapacitated from pursuing these principles. And here I should point out that actually China, which has been mentioned by one of the speakers, is also pursuing a similar policy, much more shrewd, much less obvious, and much more far-reaching of by tying down sovereignty of European states and European Union as a whole through various means of investment, purchase of critical infrastructures, from the port of Piraeus to energy company in Portugal, which creates future preconditions for limiting the exercise of European states' political will. For example, there are already, as everybody knows, there are 4 topics you are not allowed to touch upon in official meeting with the Chinese officials, which is 2 T's, Tibet and Taiwan, human rights, and prisoners of conscience. These are the things which are already we the freest region of the world are not free to pursue, because that might endanger our meat exports or or investment from the Chinese People's Republic, not to be confused with the Republic of China, which is a genuine democracy, even now. Finally, let's go back to Nord Stream. The third implication of Nord Stream, as my Ukrainian colleagues sort of point out is that if the war in the east of Ukraine had been sort of fairly kind of low scale, one of the reasons might be that still some pipelines of vital importance go through Ukraine to Western Europe. Once there is an alternative and they are no longer critical and needed, it might open the sort of the way to much sort of greater and much more direct and much more forceful engagement. So in fact we can see that sort of, as act of exercise of sovereignty of two nations can affect the sovereignty of a third nation indirectly. Well, what does that mean? That means that actually the sovereignty as it is traditionally and commonly understood doesn't live up to today's sort of requirements. And of course there is a mantra that we live in a globalized, interconnected world where sovereignty is no longer a relevant concept. But I think that path of thinking is bollocks. I think it's just that we are now looking at sovereignty in a wrong way, which doesn't mean that sort of, sovereignty is no longer relevant. I think it is a very relevant concept, but we are conceptualizing it in a wrong way. And now a bit more metaphysics. I think as a sort of model for considering proper concept of sovereignty, we should take on a sort of distinction between, as a model, as an example, of between negative and positive freedom. As Isaiah Berlin, who unfortunately was born in Riga, not in Tallinn, famously sort of brought about, negative freedom as a freedom from constraint, but as Berlin said was the sort of the true guarantee of real political freedom, whereas positive freedom to do something, freedom towards something, when it is accepted as a political slogan, leads to diminution of freedom, authoritarian and totalitarian regimes. Also, Isaiah Berlin pointed out in his very influential but totally unsystematic and full of holes essay, The Two Notions of Liberty. The common example which is usually adopted by conservatives such as myself, and that's sort of when teaching 5-year-olds about the negative and positive freedom, when they're so inclined, is the example which involves a monkey, and that's about Darwin, who was mentioned in the previous example. And it says sort of, who is freer? A monkey who is sort of kind of randomly randomly banging the keys on a sort of keyboard of a piano, or sort of a young boy who is made to do the same exercise day after day after day, sort of, on the piano, sort of, and obviously our culture points out that it's the monkey, or the unruly child, which in Lithuania is called by the same affectionate name. Little monkey. Yes, the one who does it in every random ways is the freer than the one who has to do the same exercise and who is enslaved by the discipline and all that. That's what our culture says. But then we conservatives ask, and who in 10 years' time is going to be able to play Schubert? The little monkey or this oppressed little girl or boy? Well, clearly the latter. So the positive freedom is the freedom to do something involves a notion of educating on how to use freedom. And it's considered that it's only truly free when it can be properly used to achieve goals and to achieve common good. And I think it's very important if we adopt this model for considering sovereignty. Sovereignty not as a sort of a restraint from anybody, as a freedom from any outside restraint, but as a means to the goal of common good and to the good not only of the nation exercising freedom, but also to the world as a whole, and at least to the society of nations that one lives in. And I think it's very important to point out here that sovereignty is an empty notion unless it is exercised, unless it is used for a goal politically. And once exercised, it is invested. It's sort of in arrangements that make it relative or relational. Traditionally, one would say that any investment of sovereignty decreases sovereignty, but I don't think it's true. It's likewise with freedom. So if your state becomes part of a defensive union, you are no longer as sovereign in a traditional sense as you used to be. For example, you cannot go to war with Latvia. However much you might wish that, but sort of being part of NATO sort of prevents you from doing it. Likewise with freedom, I mean, sort of, freely choosing one woman over thousands of potentials once in marriage decreases your freedom to date others. in principle, if not in practice of that. So one has to think of it as a way of investing one's sovereignty. And this is where I think it's very important that ethical concerns and ethical dimension becomes paramount. The content of sovereignty is as important as the formal structure of it. And that content is inseparable from values, from the value background in which these decisions to invest sovereignty are undertaken. Just as in the notion of positive freedom, the ethical upbringing in such a way that teaches us to use our freedom responsibly, morally, in consideration of other person's dignity, in solidarity with others and in respect to others, only then such person can be said to be truly free. So sovereignty is exercised is only exercised properly when it increases the freedom to take similar decisions. And it matters an enormous lot where your sovereignty is invested. And I would say that the sovereignty has to be invested in such a way which increases your potentiality to act further as a sort of principle. What do I mean? Well, we are sort of in a debate, which I don't know how virulent it is in Estonia, but which opposes European Union versus national sovereignty. And in Europe as a whole, this I can say quite responsibly, there is a lot of fear on that account. That on the one hand, there are federalists who want to relegate all sort of important decisions on the European level. On the other hand, there are sort of defenders of national sovereignty who say that no, we cannot give up our national sovereignty. And this conflict is kind of like very binary. It's either or. And it hinges on the notion of this traditional notion of sovereignty, which supposes that you cannot sort of you can have both, and you can either have one or the other. The defenders of national sovereignty would like to preserve untouched national sovereignty and do not recognize any idea of sharing sovereignty, of co-sovereignty, whereas the federalists would like to take away from the nation states in Europe most or at least essential part of their competences and relegate it to some sort of supranational federal government or state. And both positions are, I think, unrealistic. And this is where we come to REALPOLIITIKA. Yes, I think the position of national sovereignty, of defenders of national sovereignty, doesn't recognize the very salient fact that separate European nations no longer have a critical mass in the present-day world in order to make the rest of the world sort of take them into account. I mean, sort of maybe one or two of the states in the Union, but the rest can no longer sort of shape or influence the world outside the European Union in such a way that they can meaningfully exercise their sovereignty. And they can only exercise their sovereignty through the mechanism of pooling their collective political wills in the union, through the union and by the union. Whereas the federalists, who are less of a concern for me here, do not properly estimate the fact that European nations and the states that represent them have a sort of and hinge their political life on the need to regulate their vital existential area, and they're going to exercise that political will to any attempt to oppose any attempt that tries to usurp this competence. So, in fact, we have to get out of this dilemma, which opposes two notions of sovereignty, or sort of two levels of sovereignty, into some sort of notion of co-sovereignty or shared sovereignty, invested sovereignty, whereby nation states invest their sovereignty in the Union to make it actually count in the very increasingly dangerous and increasingly uncertain world of the future, as the minister pointed out. It's going to be a very sort of critical time. So now we're in the crossroads of two alternatives. Whether we're going to look for a way of combining these sovereignties into a new notion, or we're going to be observers of how the economic international laws made by others are sort of influencing the global arena, and we're just sort of trying to adapt and run after the train of global politics. And here I would like to come to the value sort of point. I think that, and I think it's fair to point out that historically, Europe was strongest when it was united on the foundation of shared values, such as during Cold War era. And there was no formal framework in many instances to articulate such, but it was then that we could talk, actually, without any institutional framework, about a sort of European sovereignty. When it opposed either Cold War or sort of Turks in the 16th century, that then sort of the different sovereign political wills were merged into a sort of semblance of European sovereignty. And when only it acts on the world stage to defend and propagate its values, that Europe achieves a sort of united will which could be considered a sovereignty. So, in fact, I think we can speak of European sovereignty only as sovereignty of shared values. And as a contrast to current situation, which is characterized by kind of very timid universalism. Yes, we do recognize this sort of the importance of European values, but when it comes to Middle East, then maybe a sort of other sets of values are more applicable there. When it comes to China, then yeah, maybe the Chinese way of life has this way there. And I have really no patience with this way of thinking. I think it's just sort of born out of the timidity. To me, sort of a good example of European universalism as opposed to sort of this kind of multiculturalist sort of approach is General Napier, who was General Governor of India in the 19th century. When the relatives of a woman who was burned with her husband were brought to justice and to court of law, they claimed that they could not be culpable because that's a national custom to burn the widow together with her husband, a living widow, clearly, yes. To which General Napier replied, and our English national custom is to hang the murderer by the neck till he dies. And I think this is sort of, this is a ironic inversion of this kind of multiculturalist sort of argument. And I think that we have to be much more assertive about our universality of our values. But then, of course, in order to do that, we have to bridge the value gap between the East and the West, between the new and the old members of the Union. If the old members fail to comprehend the vital existential concerns of the new member states, such as Russian threat, if they try to poo-poo, saying, "Oh, no, we just need more dialogue," then they cannot expect to be listened to respectfully by the new members when they put forward exposition about how fundamentally central are transgender sort of rights to democratic politics. So there's a lot of learning and education to be done, and then on the one hand, when you imagine ordinary Italians who are not only shocked but actually sort of remain totally indifferent and sometimes are even pleased by the sight of Matteo Salvini wearing Putin T-shirt in the Red Square, that's one part of the education. On the other hand, we as sort of members of new European Union states have also to comprehend the depth of anguish that the very same Italians experience when thousands of immigrants land on their shores every day, and they are left basically sort of alone to cope with this, and the profound transformation that it brings to their economy, societies, and all that. So, I think on the one hand we have to pare down these values to fundamentals. On the other hand, we have to do a lot of learning in order that we do agree that these are vital concerns that we can agree upon, and this forms the basis of values on which we can build shared European politics and shared European sovereignty. So unless the states that hope to profit from Nord Stream 2 can understand and take into consideration the concerns of the new members of the Union, this project of bringing together a more unified sort of political will in Europe is going to be doomed. Talking about neighborhood, it was mentioned, so the very last sort of kind of, 5 sentences. Well, there are 2 models of integration. One is opportunistic. which means basically, well, we get security and financial injections, and in exchange we sort of subject ourselves to some sort of exotic requirements, such as, LGBT rights through gritted teeth. And this is the model that actually is professed by quite a few people in Ukraine and Georgia. Okay, we'll live with that, but sort of we want to get that. And I don't think it's fair. I don't think it's a lasting union can be built on such a sort of exchange. I think what we have to talk about is expansion of the area of freedom and reconnect freedom to prosperity and growth of the societies. I mean, the old Washington consensus has been long replaced by Beijing consensus, and the area of freedom is diminishing for 12 years in a row. And that's a topic for another sort of very big talk. But I think we have to build a new Washington consensus which links freedom with prosperity and growth, and to replace Beijing consensus, and that is inseparably linked with fundamental values. And I want to underline the centrality of Ukraine for that, and hence my tie. It's not only Sweden, but Ukraine. As a path towards democratic Russia. I mean, unless we can show that actually, the Western model, societal model, takes off in this country, which has been sort of in the crossroads of destructive forces of history for so many centuries, unless we use this as a positive example to show that yes, actually this East Slavic culture is amenable to democratic values and sort of prosperity and high standards of governance, then there is no hope of kind of emitting soft power towards Russia. And for that we have to gear ourselves to very long-term strategy and long-term play. And this is more or less what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Thank you.